thanks the speakers and everyone who found the time to be here today in this Zoom format, which is kind of, it has been what the whole education kind of also peace building processes has moved here online. So it's an interesting experience for sure. First of all, I want to introduce myself. I'm Vano Abramashvili. I represent Caucasian House, and I want to say thanks to our partner organization, International Alert, and our donors, USAID, since this very event is organized with the partnership of those organizations. And basically, before we move on to the subject, I want to also introduce our speakers. First in line is Ossetia Vartanian. She is she works for the International Crisis Group, and she is a senior analyst working on the South Caucasian region. Also, I want to introduce Isabella Jean. She is actually joining us from the US. She is an independent consultant, and she teaches at Brandeis Heller School for Social Policy and Management, and she has a vast experience in the monitoring evaluation of the peace building programs, and herself was one of the leading person who actually worked in the CBA collaborative learning projects. So she kind of is also a vast experience in peace building area. Basically, this very topic today, what we're gonna discuss, is very hot, let's say, because the COVID-19 basically is posing a huge challenge to this whole peace building process, locally here in the South Caucasus as well as globally. Basically, since it's a very new topic, new challenge, still we are in the process of finding the best practices, how we can deal with this challenge, deal with this issue, especially here locally, and where the people actually, even before this very pandemic situation, the freedom of movement was already under huge, let's say, limitations. So it's like, let's say, it has doubled our efforts now to deal with this very issue and to find the physical space for interaction. Basically, I suggest to firstly discuss the local challenges here in the South Caucasus. I'm sure Ossetia will discuss beyond the paper which Crisis Group presented in May, which is called the COVID-19 Challenge in the Post-Soviet Breakaway Statelets. You can find this paper on the website of International Crisis Group. It's not only about the South Caucasus, but on Ukraine as well and Moldova. So, so basically you can find more on that in this very paper. Then we will move on to the more kind of the global analysis of what's happening globally and what this pandemic kind of poses to the all peace building efforts around the globe. For example, there was also a very interesting report by Conducive Space for Peace, Humanity United, and Peace Direct. And basically, even with these small observations, so we can see that this problem, this pandemic, and the social distancing, first of all, undermines the many peace building efforts, because it kind of limits the physical space of interaction, which is number one in peace building efforts globally. So thank you. I hope I didn't my speech wasn't too long. So I hope that I will give now the speakers 15-20 minutes, and then we'll have the Q&A session. So, Olesya, floor is yours.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Very nice to be with you. Although only via Zoom. I will speak in English, but you guys can pose questions in any languages, regional languages, please. I can understand what you're saying. Well, I work for the International Crisis Group, and we have been following this crisis from the day one, I would say. And the main development started in mid-March. And that was kind of by chance also that I personally was involved in some of the discussions about how to handle that with some of the officials here in the South Caucasus and also with some foreign diplomats. And although it's quite a short time, but I would say that this is a really very interesting period for people like me. Usually people say that academics, researchers, journalists, those who work on conflicts, you know, they often are waiting for the war, for some kind of eruption of the conflict to see how it develops, because this is also the time when most of the activities happen. And we kind of learn many things about ourselves as well during periods like this. Well, you know, we were lucky enough not to have a direct conflict here, but at the same time, look, I mean, we actually were observing this COVID crisis, and that was also, in a sense, a crisis situation that I would probably argue showed many of the cracks and also provided some opportunities for those who are involved in the processes. Well, such a broad introductions, but I will try to demonstrate it by three examples, by talking about three examples here in the South Caucasus. And I personally work on Abkhazia, South Ossetia and Nagorno-Karabakh. And all three cases, all three entities are very distinct. They are really very different. But at the same time, there are some commonalities. And of course, the main thing is that all of these three entities, they are the regions that are, do not have an official status, that they're not recognized by the UN and some other international organizations. And that means that the authorities that are in the main towns of these regions, they have limited capacity in terms of interactions with the international institutions. And I'm not talking about only diplomacy, but for example, economic or health providers and things like that. All three entities are quite isolated. So neither of these three has airport. And in that sense, probably this was one of the reasons why they were not really having lots of cases, at least initially, because they are just like isolated physically. There are not that many internationals who travel there and who could bring with COVID there. And the first thing is, look, I mean, all three of them, they exist in this fragile, with their fragile status for quite a while. And that means that all three of them have been having some certain problems with, in terms of providing health support. And that is not only in terms of not having proper infrastructure, but actually in many cases, they do not really have doctors, you know, who are professionals and who can help. And look, I mean, this is the case not only in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which most of us may know better, but this is also the case in Nagorno-Karabakh. And the other thing is, of course, it has to do with some problems in terms of the local authorities not having problems with the governance. So they can impose certain restrictions. They may, I don't know, write beautiful letters, statements, laws, but that does not mean that they are able to impose them. And that was a really very important thing during the pandemic, because some of the de facto authorities, they were in fact trying to do things and the local population was not really following the rule. Well, Abkhazia is definitely a success story. And Abkhazia is a success story not only for the South Caucasus, but for the whole post-Soviet space. And I do not know that much about some other places, but when we were discussing with my colleagues from all around the world, it was quite interesting, I mean, very interesting feeling in terms of realizing that with Abkhazia has been on its own been quite a success story, and not for the only for this region. And why it has been a success story is because when the whole thing was starting in the beginning of March, the local de facto authorities were smart enough to start reaching out to everyone possible, you know, no matter which government with officials represent, where these people come from. They were reaching out to everyone asking for help. And that really worked because for the first time in a very long time, the de facto authorities received, and they were very fast to receive that support from the European Union, from the US, and then Russia also started helping them. And so, I mean, they were able to reach out to everyone, no matter whether these officials, organizations, states recognize them or not. That actually created a certain precedent that very few, unfortunately, followed, in at least in the entities in the statelets in the post-Soviet space. Abkhazia is a rare case when the WHO specialists were able to travel there and to observe the situation on the ground and to provide a certain advice to the local leadership. And that helped really, because they provided very detailed plans, and that was not only just like for the current situation that the entity was such at that time, but actually for potential deterioration and how the entity should get out. So that was quite a comprehensive thing. And for Abkhazia, that was a real support. And when I was working on this paper, and I spoke to a number of de facto officials, and all of them were saying how grateful they are for this kind of support that they were able to receive. Well, Abkhazia, while not having many cases, COVID cases, and one would claim that this is not only because they are lucky, but actually because they were able to implement many of the advice much of the advice that they received from the WHO specialists, and also could make use of the basic medical supplies that they were receiving. Anyway, so with all of that, Abkhazia has been quite in a good shape. Definitely the best one among the entities in the South Caucasus and in the whole post-Soviet space. And currently the de facto entity is facing another problem, and it has to do with economy. Basically, they do not have money, and this is already the second month when some of the local pensioners and people who work for the de facto institutions, they are not receiving salaries, and there are reports about shortage of cash already. And this is something that many of the de facto officials told me in the very beginning, when the whole crisis was only unfolding. They were saying that they were expecting these problems and they didn't know how to handle that, mainly because, look, Abkhazia cannot get a loan from the IMF or any kind of international financial structure. So the only place where they can get cash is Russia, and Russia apparently is already quite short on financial support. At least like the leadership, the past leadership, traveled there for 3 times, and we do not see any kind of indication that they are to receive any kind of funds. Well, next to Abkhazia is South Ossetia, and it is like a black and white because it's a very different case. South Ossetia received exactly the same offers, offers of support from the WHO, from the international communities. And what happened in the end is that the local leadership just said that they don't care, And they said that they don't care, first of all, about their own population, and that they would not receive any kind of support coming from the Western world. They were keeping a hope that if they have a crisis, Russia will come and help them. That was a bad decision, in my opinion, because much of the support that South Ossetia was about to receive, similar to Abkhazia, that had no status-related implications, and much of it was supposed to get streamed as a humanitarian, sole humanitarian support. What happened there in South Ossetia is that there were spikes in the cases. They are trying to regulate it more or less. But when I speak to the people there who I know in South Ossetia, they openly express their they are so frustrated that the whole story unfolded this way, because I mean the information about all these offers coming from the WHO and others, they were getting leaked to the media, and everyone was kind of getting that, look, I mean, yeah, someone can die just because the leadership is still playing politics. And I spoke to some diplomats, and they were saying that they literally were spending weeks talking to the de facto authorities just to make them understand that nothing from the offers had any kind of political implications. So yeah, South Ossetia is in a bad shape, and unfortunately, the only people that they can blame for this, it's their de facto president, first of all, and some people around him, because I can tell you that when I was doing my research, I spoke to different people in different institutions there on the ground, and opinions were very different. Some of them were just openly saying that we are for the support coming from abroad. And the third case is really very, very different from Abkhazia and South Ossetia. It's Nagorno-Karabakh. In Nagorno-Karabakh, it's a very isolated place and very much dependent on Armenia. And from the very beginning, officials on the ground, they were quite open that they really need the support. And some of them told me that actually that could be really cool. I mean, that could really help if they could get any kind of advice in terms of actually regulating how to handle this COVID crisis from the WHO. Well, lots of diplomacy was invested into that, because there was a need to get Baku's green light for that, and lots of diplomacy. And I can tell you that even Moscow, despite its own problems, got involved and spoke to Baku a number of times. The mediators organized the first ever online talks between foreign ministers of Armenia and Azerbaijan. They produced a very beautiful correlated statement, and but unfortunately no actions followed. So the main problems on the ground, they are still the same. They did not have their own laboratory, and all the test samples had to travel to Yerevan. So they were waiting for a long time, like hoping that at certain moment they could receive some support from abroad, but that did not happen. And what happened in the end is basically Yerevan helped them to construct with laboratory. And yeah, Nagorno-Karabakh is currently having the biggest number of confirmed cases among the entities in the South Caucasus. And this, of course, has to do, first of all, with the fact that Armenia remains the most affected country in the South Caucasus, with almost 27,000 cases and over 100, almost 100 people who died from the COVID. Well, just to conclude, and I'm really very sorry if that was kind of too detailed and too boring, but to conclude, I would kind of make three, speculations, if it's possible. What we could learn from the COVID-19 crisis so far? And in my opinion, the first thing that we learn is that the COVID creates opportunities, and it definitely is the time when certain things can start moving, at least diplomatically. But for the success, you still need a certain kind of level of relationship and context between the parent state and the de facto entity. And I think Abkhazia and the Abkhazia case proves that well. If Tbilisi had blocked any kind of, expressed any kind of concern about all these contacts that were taking place with Sukhumi, I think much of the support would not just take place. So that is really very much a credit to the Georgian government that Abkhazia is now the success story. And Nagorno-Karabakh is another example of that. Just because Stepanakert and Baku are having zero relationship, they do not really contact, they do not have any kind of contacts. And in addition, like diplomacy between Armenia and Azerbaijan is really down in the recent months. That basically blocked all the conversations for real actions to provide any kind of support on the ground. The second thing that probably I would highlight is, and it's amazing, honestly, I mean, for the whole world is now in the pandemic, and all of us are affected by the COVID-19. But that was really amazing to see how much foreign support was going to Abkhazia, and how much all the diplomats were eager to invest into the diplomacy to provide support, to help, and to help not only with diplomacy, but to provide actual help. What happened with Abkhazia is amazing, really. I mean, we all are affected, and affected personally as well. I mean, we all have to sit we had to sit at our homes, and had to we all were worried about our parents, and this is often the time when you do not really think about others. But what we saw here in the South Caucasus is that all these foreign actors, they were so much eager to help, and that was really amazing to see. And the first thing, and I would probably conclude with that, while the health problem stays in place, and we can observe that we all understand that this is kind of something that we will have to live with, at least like for the coming year. Definitely there will be a need for more investment into the health sector. But the other thing is the economy. And much of these entities, they will definitely, and they are already facing with huge problems with the economy when they do not have even kind of the basic funds to pay to the local populations, and that will definitely, lead to more poverty and certain consequences in that sense. And while this issue, I think, is still on the agenda, and I can see people discussing it on different levels, mainly kind of in the closed formats, but still, there will be a need to find a way, creative ways, what to do with that. And I personally would want really to see, at least like in case of Abkhazia, ways to become an opportunity rather than just a problem. And in that sense, of course, it could be good to see, for example, more interest for development of trade relationship between Tbilisi and Sukhumi. So yeah, let's see. And I would probably stop here, Vano, and if there are questions, I will take them.
Yeah, thank you, Alessia. Very interesting insights. I took several notes based on your presentation, and I also dropped a link in the chat. So if somebody wants to actually see the actual report, they can find it there. Now we can move on to Isabella's presentation, and then I think it would be good then to move on to the Q&A. So Isabella, you have your 15-20 minutes.
Great, thanks, Vano. And I do have a few slides that I will put up, mostly for links and references that participants can look at later as well, but I'll obviously use a few points from them. Can you confirm that you can see them?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. Okay, is this better?
Yes.
Great. Well, thanks so much for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to spend some time discussing this really important topic. And I'm afraid I'm going to start with some warnings and alarming news, perhaps. As many of us are probably wondering how COVID has impacted global peace efforts around the world, but we are also seeing some bright spots, and I will get to them in this discussion, and happy to discuss more based on questions from you. So there's a global peace index that is produced by an organization called Institute for Economics and Peace. It's based in Australia. It has an office in New York, and they've been doing this for quite a few years, I believe since 2012 at least. So you could actually look at their peace index over the years and how these indicators are changing. They rank 163 countries and use 23 qualitative and quantitative indicators looking at safety and security, data from national governments as well as international and independent bodies, ongoing conflict rates, so incidents of violence, extrajudicial killings and other things, as well as militarization, both in terms of defense spending and other forms of militarization, small arms, and weapons trades and arms trafficking. And their 2020 index was just put out a few weeks ago, and they are fully predicting that peacefulness in general, if we take it at the global level, at the planetary level, is expected to drop globally as a result of COVID. They expect that most indicators in the index will be deteriorating. Interestingly, one area where they see the index may actually improve is in military expenditures, because even the large countries and UN Security Council members are trying to redirect some of the resources to help fight the pandemic and to actually help recover their economy. So we could expect to see some defense budgets going down, but that doesn't necessarily mean immediate drop in conflicts. In other indicators, obviously political instability, civil unrest, violence increasing in certain places, very much undoing years of progress and development. Again, this is globally, and we'll get to some of the more specifics. Now, besides the Global Peace Index, which is linked here, and that's why I included it in a slide so you can just click on it and access it, they also published a separate piece, which is called COVID-19 and Peace Brief. And it goes in a lot more depth into the impact of COVID on violence, on rates of violence, decreasing and increasing in certain places, economic impact and the early responses, as well as impact on positive peace in places where there isn't armed conflict and there isn't a recent peace agreement, but in fact just socioeconomic inequalities and other political tensions that are maintained by improvements in governance and other ways, and they look at how COVID will impact those areas as well. And of course, rebuilding the economy. So just a little bit more on this second brief, I wanted to share a few examples that they've given that generally you could break them down into international and domestic cooperation issues, as well as more domestic socioeconomic drivers of conflict. So overall, in terms of international cooperation, of course, we're seeing a lot of tensions between different countries, US and China, obviously over the role of WHO and continued trade disputes. as well as just bickering over the origins of the virus. And that's just kind of the politics of how the global pandemic response is being reflected in these tensions, as well as increasing political instability, general strikes in Europe. We are seeing tensions between India and China, of course, in Kashmir, which was already very tense before COVID arrived. And generally, in terms of international assistance and foreign aid budgets, there are expectations that foreign aid budgets will drop dramatically, significantly. We're seeing some of this already. Some of the funds that had been dedicated to governance and long-term development programming will be redirected to emergency response and immediate COVID response. And it will mostly impact deeply the already fragile and conflict-affected countries like Liberia, Afghanistan, South Sudan, which are already dependent on international aid and dependent as well on a lot of the political and governance work that usually is funded through such, for example, security sector reform or criminal justice sector reform and other things. And in terms of the socioeconomic drivers inside the countries, within the borders of countries, of course, we're seeing it sharpening, and I think we heard Olesya also refer to this on how that looks in the South Caucasus. It is sharpening the challenges that have already been there, the socioeconomic inequalities in wealth, labor conditions, unemployment, obviously, due to COVID is very much putting that into focus, as well as just growing mistrust in the political system, distrust in political leaders. Food security by far is one of the areas that most international aid workers are looking at with a lot of alarm. Already there were 53 countries that were showing some signs of food insecurity and early warning signs of famines. Yemen, of course, is a country that has struggled with that because of the ongoing civil war, Venezuela and other countries. And now these situations are becoming only worse. So these are obviously important drivers that often lead to mobilization and conflict escalation. That's why they're important to understand. And it's a very brief summary here. If you'd like to see the full analysis of what that looks like and digging into sub categories under each of this, I highly recommend you read that second brief, and I'll make sure that all the links are shared with Anna and Vano. So what are some of the bright spots? I don't know if you may have seen in the news, there was an attempt in early April by the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, to call for a global ceasefire all around the world. So basically a ceasefire that would at least temporarily halt all armed conflict in all parts of the world, so that governments and local subnational governments, as well as community leaders and other institutions, can focus on the pandemic. There was a lot of verbal support for it, and lots of interesting pieces written on it throughout the spring, as well as support on social media and so on. But I'm afraid to say there wasn't really a political will by armed groups all around the world, or the governments who are continuing to wage war, including in Syria and other places. There wasn't really a political will to do this. However, local ceasefires have been signed. I'm mentioning only a few here. There are actually a couple more examples. We don't know if they will hold, and some of them are not significant enough. The Colombian example is between two armed groups in Colombia, which are not necessarily the most prominent ones, but they signed a ceasefire early on in late March to allow for medical aid to pass to areas controlled by them, so that the population can in fact be tested and receive support and aid. A very important assistance is not held up. The same happened in Mali between two groups, and there have been hopes of ceasefires in Yemen on and off. There have been some ceasefires signed, but broken ever since. There are even more localized ceasefire examples. I do want to mention one that right here in the US, where in several cities, drug gangs have agreed to a ceasefire so that hospital beds can be freed up for COVID-19 patients. A similar ceasefire was signed by gangs in Haiti who united, 3 of the main gangs united, and are basically halting their kidnapping and other activities so that the government can provide medical aid to the population. I guess these bright spots are only interesting if they hold and they become bigger, bigger than just localized ceasefires. And actually become more of embedded in socio-political agreements on how to move forward. On locally led peace building, I just want to mention a couple of things that I personally am looking at with the colleagues who are concerned with the role of local peace builders that needs to be recognized, acknowledged, elevated, and properly funded. There's increased responsibilities on local organizations in conflict-affected regions to step up and to support public health efforts, to support communication and information sharing efforts, to be the mediators, the dialogue facilitators that are also needed as conflicts and tensions rise. They also, of course, focus a lot on social cohesion questions and trust building, because in a number of places, medical professionals are not trusted. However, the funding for this work isn't necessarily growing appropriately or in proportion to the responsibilities that are growing for these organizations. And it's important for us to recognize that the conflict sensitivity lens isn't something that we only apply after peace agreements are signed and, only when we're working directly on conflict drivers. It needs to be applied while the medical assistance is provided, public health interventions are being planned, and as future vaccination campaigns are being planned when, hopefully, when the vaccine is available. Some examples just from my own practice on why it's important. In 2012, I was doing research in Sudan, in Darfur, in the internally displaced camps out in West Darfur. And this is a population that was already in the camps because the government of Sudan tried to ethnically cleanse that entire area and basically massacred, hundreds of thousands of people. And those who survived were in the camps. There was a yellow fever outbreak in the camps as well as in other parts of Darfur. And the government of Sudan was directing medical professionals to vaccinate those tribes that voted for them first, and only then use whatever vaccines were left to vaccinate the camp population. Because clearly, politically, they didn't care about the camp population. They have tried to kill them before, and this camp population would never vote for them, for this government. And so somehow, while I was there, medical NGOs were chasing all over Darfur, trying to find nomadic tribes and vaccinate them before they could vaccinate the stationary people stuck in the camps where the outbreak was happening. And it was a highly political issue. WHO would not touch some of these challenges openly. And a lot of the international NGOs in Khartoum would not talk to me on record about it, but off the record, obviously admitted that they were vaccinating in the camps as well, just we're doing it, without documenting it. And I've seen such examples in so many places where politically marginalized groups were excluded from medical assistance. And I can see that happening in Syria when the vaccine is here. I don't know why Bashar al-Assad would want the vaccine to be going up to the northwest Syria, to the Idlib province at this point. And we can see such things happening in many, many, many other places. And so for peace builders to be able to truly challenge both the politics of it and the exclusionary decisions around how aid is provided. And I focused on medical aid, but I do want to say that this also applies to livelihoods, job recovery, employment, labor-focused recovery as well. So in this case, some organizations are directly working with WHO and ILO, the International Labor Organization, to try to bring this conflict sensitivity lens and human rights lens really up front and center right now before the vaccine is even available. Vano, how am I doing on time?
You have 3 minutes left.
Okay. Oops, sorry. I think I lost my slides. So what I wanted to finish by just saying that quite often the peace building organizations are relied on for the soft skills and process-based support that they provide in the form of negotiations, mediations, face-to-face dialogue, meetings, which of course have been impacted deeply by the travel restrictions. But I also think that a lot of the organizations at the forefront of it are now having to really speak very loudly and take risks in how they engage with ministries, how they engage with international aid providers on what it means to provide COVID-related response aid in fair and conflict-sensitive way. So I'm happy to respond to any questions related to that, but I think I'll end here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Isabella. Thanks both speakers. Basically, it's very interesting to look at, on the one hand, the South Caucasus and to kind of also see it in the context of the global challenges that COVID-19 poses to the whole conflict-affected areas globally. And as I said, it's also very recent, like very new challenge for us. We don't know yet how to adapt to this situation because the physical space is getting even more limited. And with this ongoing occupation, with these conflicts, with these health problems and access, physical access to these regions, I mean, in South Caucasus, I mean, we have many problems. So I urge to our listeners and participants to regarding this very topic, and we can now go on to the Q&A. You can raise your hands or write your question in chat, and I will be happy to read. Before we move on to the questions, I mean, I saw a comment from Lasha. Maybe Lasha wanted to say something about the Nagorno-Karabakh or ask a question about it. Sorry. Okay. Actually, okay, I see that Medea has a question. Please, Medea.
Hello, thank you very much.
Again, thank you. I want to say that it is a very hard challenge. And thank you, both of speakers, so much. It was a very interesting discussion.
Thank you so much, Sophia. And Medea probably has a question.
Hello.
Hi, Medea, I can hear
Yes, hi, yes, sorry. Yes, thank you very much. It was definitely a very interesting discussion. And as Vano mentioned, you know, it was very interesting to see how many different approaches of making peace in the COVID-19 situation exists not only in the world but in the South Caucasus as well. Well, my question would be to Olesya, because she was focusing on the South Caucasus, and also I would like to ask the question about our local context. Basically, when we are talking about peace and confidence and love and brotherhood, I think, yeah, it's natural that, as we say, friend in need is friend indeed, right? And I was really looking for the situation in the South Caucasus when the COVID-19 challenge could give us the opportunity for all three countries of the South Caucasus to be friends in need and friends indeed, right? And we could argue maybe that to some extent we did manage to do that between Georgia and Armenia, maybe. But yeah, I want to ask you, Olesya, so you made very interesting observations. You positively assessed some of the, say, Georgian government steps. You mentioned the challenges that existed, for instance, in case of Nagorno-Karabakh or South Ossetia. But what does it really take that we become friends in need and friends indeed? What does it take to improve the relationships between the societies? So here, I mean, the countries, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and also the relationships between Georgia, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Nagorno-Karabakh, right? So because I've been asking myself whether we would be able to use this as a chance for some kind of integration processes in the region. But I don't know, what would you say? Do you think we managed to do this or did we fail? If not, why not? For instance, your framing that Abkhazia's success was mostly shaped by the Georgian government's approach. I think, yes, this is very interesting and could help in a way to this, friendship purposes. But did that really happen? I mean, did COVID really gave us a chance, or gave us the region in general a chance to somewhat be a little bit better ourselves? Thanks.
Thank you, Medea. I suggest to actually go on with another question from Michael. He wrote it in chat. Olesya, did you see it? I will just read it out loud. So Michael writes, my question for Olesya: which international help was most practically helpful the most? Which countries' diplomats were helpful in the process? And glad to hear the population got this assistance effectively and practically. Okay, maybe we can hear answers from you, Olesya, now. And then we will move on to another session, another round.
Should I start, or sorry, Zvano, I lost your voice for a minute.
Yes, you can start.
Okay. I will start with Medea's remark. For me personally, it was really kind of, and look, I mean, we are still in this process, right? I mean, it's really very difficult to recognize it, but I think we kind of should be a realist. This is just the beginning of the whole story. And we were kind of making calculations with some of my colleagues, and I think till the next summer, we're definitely in stock, where we are. And in many cases, kind of, we are going to live in this crisis mode for at least a year. So there will be probably more opportunities to develop a certain kind of cooperation in that sense. I think the Georgian government did its best in terms of actually helping Armenia, definitely. Well, we heard this latest statement about the readiness of Tbilisi to provide support to send its doctors. It did not happen yet. I don't know for why. I remember some of the discussions several weeks ago with friends in Yerevan, with friends in the government in Yerevan, and they were telling me that basically, you know, they also need to understand what are the needs so that they do not have like dozens of people who do not, who would come in this difficult situation and stay in the country where the COVID-19 is so much the problem, yeah, and may get contaminated themselves. So I don't know what's the reason for that, but we saw so many examples of the Georgian government helping Armenia, and sometimes at its own expense, I would argue. From the very beginning, the Georgian government provided transport corridor to all the trucks traveling between Armenia and Russia. In addition to that, there were exchanges between with the passengers, with the citizens returning from different places. I'm sure lots of you saw with young teenagers coming from the US, and they first traveled to Tbilisi and then they went home in Yerevan. There were many more things that are not yet public, but they are kind of gradually becoming public. Like, for example, the Georgian government actually established a successful cooperation with Moscow, which is extremely surprising. And we even saw the statement by Maria Zakharova thanking Tbilisi. That was kind of really very interesting for me personally, also to hear the Russian ambassador in Yerevan talking about almost 200 Russian citizens who got a corridor, who were able to travel through Georgia to return to Russia with their cars. None of this is public. The Georgian government is not discussing many of the things, but certain things are happening. And the same is with Abkhazia. I mean, certain things are happening and they are not really getting publicized. And I think this is happening on purpose. Even more, some of the diplomats I spoke to and some of the officials, both here in Tbilisi and also in Sukhumi, they were saying that actually this kind of silence is good because it does not really disturb those, especially nationalists, you know, that are all around and that can prevent the assistance that is so much needed. I would just kind of throw it as a phrase, but I will not go into all the details, but it was really amazing to see how much cooperation has been happening between Sukhumi and Tbilisi, both through communication and physical support since early March. And for me personally, that was kind of a great thing to see. And I'm not sure there is anyone in Sukhumi, at least among the de facto authorities, who do not recognize how much Tbilisi has invested into this by at least not blocking and in many cases providing actual support. Look, in the beginning of this year, we saw a change in the leadership in Sukhumi. New people came to power. We all understand that, I mean, basically, I mean, the basis is still the same. Russia is going to stay as the main partner and provider of security. And all of this is still the same, but still the guy who is now the de facto leader, even before getting elected, the first statement that he made in the media was, I want to find a way to cooperate with Tbilisi. For me personally, I know the guy and I understand that he's serious. And I remember all this conversation even before the COVID-19 here in Tbilisi, including I was having this conversation with some of the officials. And the question was there like, so yeah, what to do? You know, I mean, how to establish some certain cooperation within the frames, within the restriction and political red lines so that we do not cross certain kind of issues and do not create some certain expectations. I mean, the status issue is all around. And yeah, people were speculating what to do and how to do and all that. And then the COVID happened and we saw this cooperation taking place. So I would argue that this is definitely not something that is going to disappear. And let me add like something that probably I should have started with. Look, one thing is, of course, I mean, when you do good things and then people may remember that, but even kind of in our life, in our real life, we know that in many cases, we remember bad things more often. And I personally am very worried that this whole situation with Nagorno-Karabakh, and that Baku received so many offers, you know, and different kind of flexible formulas, how the support could happen, took place, assistance to Nagorno-Karabakh took place. And quite a lot of people already learned about this idea, and then it did not happen. So then when they are going to have a next round of talks, if something is to happen, there will be definitely an argument, but you guys did not help us when we really needed you. So this is something that the Georgian government kind of avoided doing. Vano, would you allow me to answer to this question about Michael's question?
Yes,
and
please.
then I will stop.
Yeah,
I will be very brief, yeah?
Okay.
So look, the European Union and the US were the main providers. According to this current calculation, it's about $130,000. It's a big amount. And I understand that there are many more plans what to do, and some of them are really profound, and they are really very good. I mean, they concern support to the health sector, and they concern support to the agriculture, something that is completely not political and cannot be framed as state building. And also something that establishes a very good way for cooperation for a longer time and engagement with those who are decision makers and can have a certain say in effective control on the ground. What I personally was really I think it's really very important. It was important to see is the support of the USAID, because the USAID was the first to come up with the offer. And I think everyone I mean, those who work on this, they know that the USAID in many cases is the organization that has certain sensitivities in terms of the engagement with the de facto authorities. And this was the case when the USAID put aside many of the its own red lines. And I know that in Sukhumi, they were very grateful for that. Although for many years, there were some complexities and problems in relations. So I would probably highlight the important role of the USAID and a very positive step that was made by them. In terms of the diplomats, I would definitely highlight a great role that the EUSAR played in that sense, the EU Special Representative and his cabinet. And also in case of South Ossetia, what was the OEC team doing there, spending so much time thinking about different formulas, what can be done and how to be that was really plausible as well. But again, I mean, unfortunately, none of these efforts led to what everyone wanted to see. Yeah, I'm also glad to see that some of the people on the ground, they were grateful to receive the support during these difficult times.
Thank you, Olesya. I think Yulia Kharashvili had a question also.
Yes, thank you very much for this opportunity and for both presenters. Very interesting and informative. Olesya, thank you very much. I have question more. I have small remark to Olesya's because it's very important to know how it is developed on conflict zones, and I think it will be very interesting also to track how it will be done on the other side in IDP community and in villages affected by conflict, how COVID was affected these communities. So I think that one session we can dedicate to this. And my question is to Isabella. On 1st of July, Security Council supported new resolution, which supports call of Secretary General for Reconciliation. And it's already official document. It's not only call, it's official document of Security Council. Do you think that it can make some, at least small impact also on our protracted conflicts in South Caucasus, or somehow we could use documents of Security Council. So Security Council called to immediate and so how it was, cessation of hostilities in all situations on its agenda, and general and immediate. So do you think that we can somehow use it also for South Caucasus, talking about protracted conflicts? I mean, borderization, which was intensified very much during the COVID epidemic in few places, and some other cases where unfortunately we're not so friendly as cooperation on evacuation of people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia. There's actually another question to Isabella. So, and I will also read it out loud. It's from Nicolos. So his question is, what do we have to expect from China? We saw China took advantage of the global pandemic in Hong Kong and South China Sea and its recent tensions with India and Australia. Do we have to expect more such actions from China in those regions or any other regions while the West is trying to recover economically and financially? And how can the West counter it? So, Isabella. Now,
Thank you.
Yeah, you can.
Thank you. Yes, I'll answer the first one, the first question. I did see that yesterday, so obviously quite a few organizations are also looking at what that will mean. Unfortunately, the track record for such UN Security Council resolutions isn't necessarily promising in terms of how they are enforced and how deeply they actually impact the country level processes or processes with protracted conflicts as well. So, you know, we have to take a lot of this Security Council resolutions with a grain of salt. It's good to see that there's still some agreement at that level to call for something like that, but they often break down when it comes to the next level of political will of actually putting the money into the enforcement, implementation of this, and to the political negotiations between sovereign countries that may have all sorts of other reasons for not engaging. I think one important piece in it is the role of peacekeeping in places like Yemen or like Libya and other places, if the peacekeeping in fact can be increased and could be very much part and parcel of the pandemic response and work on reconciliation. That's something, of course, the UN has not always done very well in the past, so a lot of lessons from past failures there as well. And of course, the role of women has been elevated in that resolution based on previous Security Council resolutions on the role of women in peace processes. But it is to be seen. I think we have to wait and see what happens with that. The regional level agreements signed by African Union and ASEAN in Asia, as well as OAS here in Latin America, I think could actually have a lot more of a role in implementation, and quite often they're disconnected from the UN processes. So we'll wait and see. I do hope that it will have some positive impact, especially on active ongoing armed conflicts. On the protracted and intractable conflicts or frozen conflicts, I'm not so sure. Especially just coming from the UN, I'm really not sure. On the second question, I'm not a China expert, but of course, it's been a discussion happening in a number of other organizations that have been tracking China's expansion in all across Asia. Even as far back as 2013, Chinese troops were crossing the line of control into Kashmir. So what just happened a few weeks ago wasn't a surprise to many people who've been watching that. And I think Chinese government most likely takes a similar position like many other governments and Western governments as well, which is not to let a good crisis go to waste. And while the world is busy and fighting a pretty serious pandemic, there are all sorts of expansionists and political, moves that are happening in a number of places. And I think it was to be expected from China as well. They're not the only country who does that. Sorry if I don't have any specifics on that, but again, I don't track China politics that closely. I think Kashmir would be a very, very important area to watch and to understand what Chinese are willing to do there.
Thank you, Isabella. I didn't see any more questions or raised hands. Just for the side note, Alessia also shared the link in chat by her. It's like text by her colleague Richard Gowen about why the UN ceasefire call failed in many places around the world. So it's also should be an interesting read and timely. I will now go to the wrap up and conclusions. I want to say thanks to both speakers, to Alessia and Isabella. It was a very interesting discussion, basically timely. As I said, it's always very interesting and important not to see South Caucasus as a region isolated from the global trends. So this is why it was very interesting to have both insights, the local insights as well as the global ones, and what's been happening around us. And since we live in the time of pandemics, and many people and many thinkers are suggesting that we'll not have the world like it was, I think we'll see peace building efforts that we knew. So I guess we are now practices around, and thank you again to both of you, and thanks to International Alert and our donor USAID for this discussion. Thank you, and we'll be in touch. And I think it would be good to have another of those kind of discussion, as we go on with this, to live with this COVID-19 and how it's gonna be changing our practices. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.